Okay, picture this. It's the fall of 1989, and Eastern Europe is just exploding. The Berlin Wall is coming down, protests are erupting all over the Soviet bloc. History is happening at lightning speed. But right in the middle of all that chaos, one country pulled off a revolution that was so peaceful, so unbelievably smooth, it got its own special name. This is the story of Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution. To really get how incredible the events in Prague were, you have to look at what was happening at the exact same time, just a few hundred miles away. Because you see, 1989 gave us two very, very different endings to communist rule. So you've got Czechoslovakia on one side. Someone who was there literally described its revolution as swift, entirely nonviolent, joyful, and funny. Can you imagine? A funny revolution? And then on the other side, you have Romania. Total chaos. A period of violent civil unrest. The dictator and his wife executed by a firing squad. Over 1,000 people died in the streets. It's a night and day difference. And that brings us to the big question, right? At the same moment in history, with both nations throwing off decades of Soviet-backed rule, how did one manage this peaceful, almost theatrical transition, while the other just erupted in violence? Well, the answer starts with the unique spark that lit the whole thing off in Prague. The story of this revolution doesn't actually begin in November 1989. To really understand it, you have to go back 2 decades earlier, to a moment of incredible hope that was followed by years and years of deep repression.
So let's rewind to 1968. You had the Prague Spring, this massive wave of reform and a huge flourishing of free speech, but that hope was absolutely crushed by a Warsaw Pact invasion. And what came after was one of the most repressive regimes in the entire Eastern Bloc. Between 1945 and 1989, 250,000 Czechs were put in prison for political acts, and thousands died in those prisons or were executed. This was a pressure cooker that had been building for 20 years straight.
The breaking point finally came on November 17th. Students held a march that was actually officially approved to commemorate a student killed by the Nazis 50 years earlier. But that memorial, it quickly turned into a huge anti-communist demonstration. The students, some of them were even offering flowers to the police, were cornered and just viciously beaten.
And in the middle of all that chaos, something really strange happened. A piece of false information actually became the catalyst for the truth. A rumor started spreading like wildfire that a student named Martin Schmid had been killed by the police. Now get this, it wasn't true. But you know what? It didn't even matter. The idea that the regime had murdered a student, that's what sparked this massive, nationwide outrage and brought a previously fractured opposition together as one. That single powerful rumor, it transformed a bunch of isolated dissent into a full-blown nationwide movement. And it was organized, it was strategic, and honestly, it was incredibly creative. Just 2 days after the beatings, the opposition found its voice. And in a setting that couldn't be more dramatic, a Prague theater, actors and playwrights got together and formed what they called the Civic Forum. It was led by Václav Havel, a dissident intellectual who'd been in and out of prison for years. They became the ones to channel the nation's anger, demanding the government resign and release all political prisoners.
And the people, they responded on a scale that was just impossible for the regime to ignore. By November 25th, an estimated 750,000 people, in a country of less than 16 million, mind you, had gathered in Prague to demand change. The city squares were just overflowing. The tactics they used were just brilliant. It wasn't just about showing up for massive demonstrations. Students and actors traveled out to the countryside to break through the state media censorship. And then there was the most iconic symbol of the whole revolution, people jingling their house keys, creating this huge collective sound to signal that it was time for the communists to pack up and go home. It was literally the sound of the end.
But the real knockout punch? That came on November 27th. The Civic Forum called for a 2-hour general strike. And listen to this, an incredible 75% of the entire population participated. This wasn't just a protest anymore, it was a nationwide referendum on communist rule. And the results? They were undeniable. The government had completely and totally lost the people. Which of course brings us back to our original question. With hundreds of thousands of people in the streets and the government's authority just collapsing, why didn't the military roll in? Why didn't they have a Tiananmen Square? Why no Romanian-style civil war? Well, the answer really comes down to 3 crucial factors that all lined up at just the right moment. First, the internal communist regime was weak and divided. Second, the Soviet Union, which was their traditional lifeline, had basically cut the cord.
And finally, there was intense, coordinated international pressure. This right here is probably the single most important factor. The Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and his new policies of glasnost and perestroika, well, they meant he had absolutely no intention of sending in tanks to save hardline communist regimes anymore. The Czechoslovak premier himself admitted it. He said they knew help wasn't coming. So unlike in 1968, they were completely on their own.
And then you had the West. U.S. diplomats, like Ambassador Shirley Temple Black of all people, have been consistently linking any kind of economic aid or better relations to human rights. And this quote from the premier, spoken behind closed doors while the government was debating a crackdown, it says everything. They knew that a violent response would lead to a complete political and economic boycott. Their hands were tied by their own international agreements.
So, with no popular support, no hope of a Soviet bailout, and the very real threat of international isolation, the Communist Party, well, they just folded. And what happened next was just as remarkable as the revolution itself. The speed of this transition was just breathtaking. Only 11 days after that first student protest, the Communist Party officially gave up its monopoly on power. And by December 29th, less than 6 weeks after he was organizing protests from a theater, the dissident playwright Václav Havel was sworn in as the president of a free Czechoslovakia. Just incredible. And that spirit of peaceful transition? It kept going. A few years later, in 1993, as old national identities started to resurface, political disagreements between the Czechs and the Slovaks led to a separation. But just like the revolution, it was all done through negotiation, with no violence. It became known as the Velvet Divorce, and it created two new independent nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And that leaves us with one last thought. The Velvet Revolution is this powerful testament to strategic, creative, and massively popular nonviolent action. It proves that change doesn't always have to come from the barrel of a gun. So the question for us today is, in a world that's still so full of conflict, what can we learn from a generation that chose to rattle its keys instead of raising its fists?